Today, I'm excited to have my special guest, Professor Rita Abrahamsen, the Director of the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa. He recently published The Return of the Generals, Global Militarism in Africa from the Cold War to the Present. I'm going to paste the link to the direct access of this article right in the description panel on the upload for this video and in the comment section on our Facebook page. Professor Rita, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tita. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm very much happy to have you, and you're most welcome to the show. Can you just briefly take us through the core ideas of your article, in particular the idea of the return of the generals? What does it entail in terms of militarism and conflict analysis?
Great, thank you. And thank you again for giving me the opportunity to talk about this article, which came out a couple of years ago now, but which I think in many ways is just as important and timely now, and possibly more so than it was when it was published in a journal called Security Dialogue. So just a little bit of context, perhaps. It came out in a special issue of Security Dialogue that was focused on the relationship between security and militarism. So as such, it was kind of part of a move to start studying militarism again. And the article should be seen in that context. And it's quite interesting because the study of militarism has kind of gone through various phases in international relations. It's kind of like it had a life, then it died, and then it was reborn. And as I put it in the article, these three phases of the study of militarism coincides with the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, and then the start of what some people would call the global war on terror. And in that period of the global war on terror, where we are now, the study of militarism has kind of been reborn. It started again. Mm-hmm. But what people found, and that when they started to look at militarism again, that just calling it militarism, just like we did in the 1970s and 1980s during the Cold War, wasn't quite capturing what was going on. So, you know, those old concepts were kind of cold comfort because so many things had changed. And the new militarism is what people started calling it. They started calling it a new militarism, militarism with adjectives, liberal militarism, to capture something new, which is the way in which contemporary militarism in Africa and elsewhere is kind of married or allied to utopian ideals, to development, to humanitarianism. So military action, militarism comes with this dream of being the force that can realize development, realize humanitarian goals, democracy, and so forth. So that's the context of the article. And what I'm trying to do with the rather provocative question, return of the generals, and importantly, there is a question mark at the end of that. What I'm trying to do with that is to ask, will this new militarism that is different from the militarism of the 1980s, will this new militarism lead to a return of the generals? Or in other words, will it lead military actors, generals, militaries, armies, to yet again be as powerful in African politics as they were in the old form of militarism during the Cold War? So, spoiler alert, the answer to that question is yes, to a certain extent, but not necessarily in the same way as during the Cold War. We are already seeing in certain ways that the military actors, generals, to call them that, are becoming more important, more influential vis-a-vis political actors, vis-a-vis civilian actors in many African countries. But it's not necessarily through the means that we saw in the past, namely military coups. There are other ways in which they manage to rebalance power and politics. So that's sort of the broad argument and the key argument that I make. And maybe to help illustrate that a little bit more, it might be useful to just go back and look at Africa and the African continent in the 1970s and 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And what we saw then was that at some point in the middle of the 1970s, more than half of the countries on the continent were under some form of military rule, meaning the generals were in power.
Of course, yeah, of course.
And that also meant that something like 65% of all people in Africa lived under military rule.
Mm-hmm.
And in those countries where we had civilian rule, the politicians were very aware of the power of the military. So they were kind of always governing by looking over their shoulders and being aware of the willingness of the generals to exit the barracks and take power. If we go to Africa today, the picture is very, very different, right? Military rule has not disappeared, but it's not very common. And the military coup has equally not gone away, but it's not very common. And when it happens, the African Union will say that this is not a legitimate way of gaining power, and will fairly quickly see some kind of a transition. So what I'm trying to look at in the article is, what then if we have seen an increase in militarism, and this is indeed a new form of militarism, how will it shape political relations on the continent? And it's an argument that's at one level, at a pretty high level of generality. So I'm talking about Africa writ large, which is of course in it of itself problematic because there's so many differences. But at certain level, it's possible to generalize, but it's also possible to go into each and every country and try and give us a more specific analysis. But when it comes to the contemporary era of today and post 9/11, my argument is most directly focused on those countries that we could argue are sort of at the forefront of fighting violent extremism. So for example, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and also the countries in the Sahel. So Chad, Mauritania, Niger, Mali, and so forth. Those are the countries where this argument applies most directly. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you, at that point, maybe also want me to talk a little bit about the particular differences between the militarism of the past and the new militarism, because that's another kind of key aspect of the art. As I said in the beginning, we haven't studied militarism very much lately. So I think maybe many people who read the article or just hear the term militarism may not necessarily know what it means. And I say old militarism or Cold War militarism and new militarism now. What's the difference, and what difference does it make? There are many differences, but there are also a lot of continuities. But the point that I'm trying to hone in on is to say that there are the two key characteristics of the militarism that we saw in the Cold War. The first one is that it was to a very large extent externally driven, meaning that when African countries came to independence, mm-hmm. they didn't have their own manufacturing industries for weapons and technology. So they mostly had to import weapons, right? They had to import military equipment. They also relied to a very large extent on former colonial powers, Russia, the United States, for the training of their soldiers. So military actors went abroad to receive their training, and the equipment came from outside. So in that sense, it was externally fueled. And at the beginning of independence, African militaries were also kind of politically not very influential. But as part of the process in the 1960s and 70s, as I mentioned earlier, they very quickly gained in political influence and became dominant. And some of this is related to the way in which they were receiving their training and their equipment from the outside. The other characteristic of Cold War militarism, in addition to it being externally fueled, which, by the way, doesn't mean that African actors were just sort of passive there. There were very clear African agency, very clear African interests that were involved in militarism in each country. But the other part of it is that because of the way the Cold War functioned, the primary interests of the superpowers, as they were at that point, was to maintain international order and stability. So supporting African militaries were kind of risky business, right? Because you risked supporting armies that could then create instability. And that was risky for both the East and the West. So the focus was on sponsoring countries and armies and generals that, even if they were in some ways politically not entirely likable, would guarantee that stability. So that focus on international stability was the key. And there's something important there, because very often when people define militarism, they focus on societies that are kind of always ready for war, always prepared for war. Mm-hmm. But the militarism of this period wasn't sort of directly focused on war making. It was more on order making. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the big geopolitical condition, that even if militarism was different in each country that we can go to, depending on their history, their military, all kinds of things, however shape and form it took, it was conditioned by that overarching geopolitics of the Cold War. So if those were the two primary characteristics of Cold War militarism, what is it that's different today? Now, I've already hinted at some of it. It's still, and that is the continuity, it's still to a very large part externally fueled, in the sense that they're getting weapons from abroad, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which actually gets me to the next question that I have for you. If we are to look at it, primarily from the point at which you start to base your article on, that is to say, the Cold War. During the Cold War, both the superpowers, the United States and Russia, they both indirectly and directly sponsored wars and political coups in some parts of Africa for different political and economic interests. And a typical example that we can cite in this discussion is that of the role that the United States played in the toppling of Patrice Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the 1960s, and then was then later on replaced by the quote-unquote generals, getting to the point at which we had Mobutu Sese Seko. So in other words, what I'm just simply saying is that both the United States and Russia played some part, directly or indirectly, in this so-called proxy wars in Africa to defend certain political and economic interests. Which gets me to the question that what is it that was so significant about Africa? What was the central significance of Africa during the Cold War that brought the attention of these superpowers to the continent?
It's crucial to recall, right? And Mobutu is a good example here, that the African countries came to independence almost at the same time as the Cold War was building up, right? So what do African independent countries mean in the Cold War. I mean, in part, the Cold War was a clash of ideas, a clash of ideologies, and a fight for allies, right? And what the West, or the United States, in the case, particularly in the case of Zaire, but not only, what they were worried about was that if Mobutu fell, communism would take hold in one country after another. So the kind of domino theory, right? That you will lose one country, then you will lose another one, and the whole world will gradually turn towards communism. So that was one fear. I think also another aspect of it is, shouldn't forget that the African countries, as they became independent, represented votes in the United Nations, and the General Assembly was by now one country, one vote. So if you want to have influence through the UN geopolitically, you want to make friends on the African continent, right? And then there are a whole lot of other issues to do with resources, access to those resources. But the Cold War was a particular moment in time in this sense. But I think to come back to the topic of militarism, the Cold War was, as you said, in many ways, in some parts of Africa, a hot war, right? There were proxy wars, there were wars that were being fought on the African continent through proxy armies of communism and capitalism and freedom, as it was called then. And that's a very important part of that history and that period. But still, at the same time, overall, the fear of a superpower conflict between the East and the West, of another nuclear disaster, meant that the focus was very much on keeping the continent stable, for better or for worse, even if it meant keeping certain dictators in power. That stability was kind of the overarching objective during that period, and that's sort of one of the key aspects of the article's focus on the changes in militarism, because that's a contrast in many ways to what we're seeing today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, wonderful.
So today, you know, just so I, so I'm not entirely misunderstood here. Today, the new militarism, as we call it, is still very much focused on order and stability, state building, strengthening state institutions. It wants to do all those things.
Mm-hmm.
So the focus on stability and order has not gone like totally away. It's still very important. But because, and this is kind of paradoxical, and it's one of the key points that I wanted to make in the article. Even if today's militarism is sort of intrinsically bound up with all those good things about development and humanitarianism, and we say there can be no development without security, right? We say all those things. Even if that is one of the ways in which militarism today is spread and promoted, paradoxically, the militarism of today compared to the militarism of the Cold War is slightly more geared towards making militaries ready for battle or ready for war. Because what's the context now? The context now is not the geopolitics of balancing, right? Mm-hmm. The geopolitics now and the fear now is primarily of these violent extremist groups. Mm-hmm. And to counter those, so if we take it from the perspective of Western donors, and let's just do it from that perspective for the moment. What they are concerned is to train African armies, to equip African armies so that they can contain violent extremism, Somalia, Sahel, and so forth. Of course, they want them to do that for the sake of Africa and those countries in which these groups operate. But they also wanted to do that so that those conflicts do not spread and jeopardize the national interests of the West. And in order to do that, African armies must be trained and must be equipped to fight war, both at home and abroad. So there's a kind of contradiction, a paradox there, that we have this new militarism that is kind of wrapped up in a cuddly language of doing moral good in the world, which is at the same time more battle ready than in the past.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. What are some of the consequences, the socio-economic and political consequences of this quote-unquote contemporary global militarism? If we are to look at it, particularly in the sub-Saharan part of the continent, many African leaders seem to be obsessed with military spending. Almost all political debates, when it comes to the presidency or even other discussions made in parliament and other platforms, are simply primarily rooted and based on the discussion of military spending, excessive military spending by governments and by states. Is it justified? Is it necessary to focus on military spending at a time that we have a severe economic crisis and we have other needs that need to be funded? What's your take and thought on that?
Mm-hmm. It's a very good question, and it's a very important question, right? How do we justify how much is spent on security forces? And it's quite striking to see that in many parts of the world, and there's some very good data on this coming out of Sweden from an organization called SIPRI that measures military spending in each country year by year. And we can see that military spending in many African countries have gone up in recent years. And you know, that's I think in many ways part of what we are discussing here, that once the world has become in a way so preoccupied with security that every problem, such as violent extremism, which is in large part, of course, a security problem. But there are other aspects to those security problems that can be found in root causes of political exclusion, economic exclusion, and so forth. And one of the dangers of a focus on security and military solutions to all kinds of problems is that resources automatically go towards security solutions rather than towards military solutions, rather than towards political solutions. And I think that's one of the dangers of this new militarism. I think, you know, that to my mind, there are very many dangers, and many, you mentioned social, political, economic implications and consequences. And I think there are a lot of them. It's very hard to sort of draw a direct causal link from A to B, but we can at the same time see trends and connections. And I think one danger for me is because the military and security actors are now seen as so central to security and stability by virtue of their role in fighting extremism. They become kind of middlemen or brokers in between civilian politicians and the international community. And that gives them power, right? Vis-a-vis civilians, vis-a-vis civil society, vis-a-vis politicians. And that's sort of tipping of the balance in favor of military actors, so that they occupy more and more roles and position in areas of life that we previously regarded as civilian areas of life, like development. So that's one danger. I think another one is that we see that African actors and leaders can use the security discourse to brand all kinds of legitimate political opposition as security concerns, as terrorists. I'm looking at the poster behind you that says politics and protest, right? But in the current climate, it's very easy to look at those protesters and call them, terrorists, violent extremists. And then you can use that discourse, and you can use what is now your better trained, your better equipped military and security forces to crack down on those protesters in the name of security.
Yeah.
And not only security, but in the name of development, because we can't have development if we don't have security. So it kind of legitimates that kind of, it can legitimate that kind of crackdown on political opposition. And that in turn, of course, is devastating for democracy.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. You get me to an interesting idea that that just recently dominated political discussion at a continental level, our regional bodies, to say the African Union and other organizations like SADC and ECOWAS have had this discussion of silencing the guns by 2020. The idea was to silence the guns by 2020, but of course you will agree with me that the guns have, of course, obviously and openly not been silenced at all, which actually shows that the idea, there's a significant gulf between aspiration and reality. We haven't been able to achieve many of the objectives that we set out ourselves to achieve as of 5 years ago and as of 6 years ago. And there's a serious problem in as much as the implementation of this policy of silencing the guns is concerned. What's your take on the idea that the over-reliance on foreign aid and international economic assistance sort of makes African countries vulnerable to externally induced wars or conflicts, given that he who feeds you controls you?
Well, I'm not sure if that's a full picture of what's going on the continent. One of the interesting things to think about in sort of the broader picture is that Africa is actually, or many African countries, is becoming less aid dependent than they were in the past. But the military assistance and the security assistance is going up. So there's a complex set of relations there. I also think it's very interesting what you mentioned about silencing the guns. By 2020, we all, that was an extremely ambitious and maybe foolhardy slogan to put out there, because it couldn't be achieved, right?
Yeah, obviously.
But it's interesting because we do require some optimism and some idealism, and it's important to try. It's important to have ideals, and I kind of admire the African Union a little bit for the bravery on that, but it was also doomed to fail if we take it literally by 2020. But I think the way you put the question is also allowing me maybe to clarify one part of this, which is to say that it isn't necessarily that, or at least to my mind, that all kinds of security assistance to militaries and police forces are in and of themselves wrong, right? It is true that many people's lives on the African continent would be better if we found a solution to violent extremism. So in and of itself, these forms of assistance, forms of security assistance, military assistance, is not necessarily wrong. The challenge is to find a way of doing it that doesn't empower military actors and that doesn't promote militarism in the sense of advancing military solutions above and beyond political solutions or socioeconomic solutions, civilian solutions. And this is kind of the very tricky balancing act that I think in part that the silencing the guns slogan helps us draw attention to as well, because I've sat in meetings where people have talked about silencing the guns, and everyone will say, of course, when we talk about, for example, Boko Haram, of course, this doesn't have a military solution. This has a political solution, a development solution. And then in the next sentence, the same people start talking about strengthening the military, strengthening the police, right? Because it's almost like those technical solutions are easier and more visible or clearer. And I think that has been a bit of a paradox in that slogan of silencing the guns, but it also illustrates the complexity of the matter.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Rita Abrahamsen. Viewers and listeners, this was Professor Rita Abrahamsen. She is currently the director of the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa in Canada. She published an article in January of 2018 that is entitled Return of the Generals, Global Militarism in Africa from the Cold War to the Present. This article can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste on the upload for this video right in the description panel on our YouTube channel and in the comment section on our Facebook page. Professor Rita, thank you very much for joining me on this show.
Thank you, Tida. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
That is great. Have a good day, and do not forget to say hi to your loved ones.
I will do. Same to you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Wonderful.
I like